What does a legend wish for when the end is near? Ozzy Osbourne, the Prince of Darkness, the man who turned chaos into a kingdom, closed his final chapter at the age of 76. But he didn't just leave behind sorrow, he left behind a raging void in the bloodstream of rock. Ozzy wasn't just an artist, he was the storm that shattered boundaries, a defiant soul who turned screams into legacy, darkness into gospel. His passing silenced the world. Fans crumbled. Bandmates stood frozen, caught in the eye of fate. And his family, clutching each other's hands in the stillness as if time itself had stopped breathing. But Ozzy didn't slip away like a whisper. He erupted, one last thunderclap into the sky. In his final weeks, when words failed him, his eyes, his trembling grip, every fragile breath clung to something unspoken, a final dream, a sacred wish, one only Sharon could hear, his wife, his warrior, the keeper of his final spark. And, before we trace the cracks left behind by a man who refused to fade quietly, raise your hand, your thumb held high, not just as a farewell, but as a salute, to the man who turned pain into permanence. And as silence thickened, a stillness fell heavier than grief. It was the waiting. Waiting for time to surrender, for breath to pause, for the inevitable to come. Their countryside home, once alive with laughter, rock riffs, and chaos, now echoed only the rustle of curtains, birdsong, and the broken rhythm of Ozzy's breathing. The godfather of mayhem sat still, frail, sunk deep into his chair, his voice, once thunder, now barely a whisper. Not from lack of words, but from a body that no longer answered. Parkinson's had robbed him of nearly everything, his walk, his strength, even his appetite, but not the fire in his eyes. Sharon never left. Her hand stayed in his. Her eyes caught every flicker of pain, every breath that hung on. She had stood beside him through it all, the stadiums, the madness, the betrayals, but nothing could prepare her for this silent war. Every morning, he asked for the same two things, a cup of tea and Sharon. No painkillers, no tubes, just the warmth of what mattered. Time blurred as they sat, drifting between memory and now. Ozzy would speak of Aston's soot-black streets, cold winters, hungry nights, and the trembling thrill of his first Sabbath gig. He would laugh weakly at Tony's riffs, Geezer's stubborn pride, Bill's driving beat, calling them his brothers of thunder. Then his voice would tremble, and he'd whisper about his children. Hey, Kelly, fierce and blazing, Jack, his anchor, Amy, quiet but unshakable. Even his grandkids, he wanted them to remember the storm, not the silence. Sharon began to notice a shift. His gaze grew sharper. His words, fewer but three. A strange calm had taken hold. He was preparing, and he wasn't alone. One by one, the children came. Kelly, Jack, Amy, and from his first marriage, Jessica and Lewis. They held his hands, kissed his brow, whispered their love. These weren't goodbyes. They were moments of presence. One night, Ozzy rasped, barely audible, "Promise me. They'll remember the fire, not the flicker." Sharon nodded, biting her lip, locking his fragile hand tighter in hers. She had seen him destroy and rebuild himself time and time again, but never like this. Never so broken in body, yet so defiantly alive in soul. Then came late June 2025. Dusk spilled gold across the estate. Ozzy looked out the window, eyes clearer than in weeks. Slowly, he turned to her, gripped her hand, and whispered, "I don't want them to remember the wheelchair. I want to give them one last roar, where it all began." It wasn't a request. It was a mission, his final act of rebellion. Sharon didn't cry. She nodded, and the very next morning she moved. She made calls, pulled favors, pushed past limits. She contacted voices from decades ago, arranged what doctors said was impossible, and paced empty halls whispering, "He needs this." It wasn't for glory. It wasn't legacy. It was love. Fierce, raw, unshaken love. Ozzy could barely stand. But Sharon believed. That belief was all she had left. She didn't know if he could walk, much less perform. But she would find out. She would carry this flame across oceans if she had to. Because deep inside that fading frame, Ozzy was still there. Still thunder, still storm, still the Prince of Darkness. And now, that final dream was hers to carry. And she would carry it. Not in sorrow, but in fire. In fury. In everything she had left of him. For over 40 years, Sharon Osbourne had not just been a wife. She was Ozzy's protector, his compass, the one who stood firm when the world tore him apart. She was the whisper when his voice failed, the pillar when his spirit fractured. Through decades of chaos, she held the line. Between antiseptic corridors and roaring arenas, rehab beds and red carpets, whispered prayers and broken promises. Ozzy was fire. Sharon was stone. But in the final months, the weight shifted. His last wish, spoken with quiet urgency, became hers to carry alone. Not even their children knew. She guarded it like a fragile ember in a storm. Doctors called it reckless. Friends pleaded with her to reconsider. Even Ozzy, fragile and fading, whispered, "Don't let me go out a fool." But Sharon just leaned in, fierce and calm. "You'll go out a king." Behind locked doors, she orchestrated the impossible, not with money but with conviction. She begged, fought, maneuvered. When he could no longer grip the mic, she tied it gently to his hand. When he forgot the words, she breathed them into his ear. Every sleepless night, every favor called in, became scaffolding for one final resurrection. Not a show, but a reckoning. It was never about applause. It was about dignity, about love, about letting him leave as he lived, roaring, defiant, unforgettable. She wasn't building a concert. She was building an ending, stitched in loyalty, nailed with sacrifice, and lit with devotion. When the moment came, she stood before him, not trembling, but ablaze. July 5th, Birmingham, one last roar. And in his eyes, something flickered, something death couldn't extinguish. The sun dipped low over Birmingham as if morning began before the night. July 5th arrived like a prayer answered in thunder. The city shimmered, not with fame, but with reverence. Villa Park stood not as a venue, but as a shrine. And within its gates, 40,000 hearts waited, not for entertainment, but for communion. When Sharon wheeled Ozzy onto the stage, his body fragile, but his gaze steady, the crowd fell to silence, then rose in a wave that shook the earth. He was not just their icon. He was their wound, their mirror, their redemption. Dressed in black, seated like a monarch forged by pain, Ozzy sang not with power, but with truth. When he sang, "Mama, I'm coming home," it was no longer a song. It was a farewell, a hymn, a final breath carried on melody. Then came Crazy Train, his chaos, his fury, his legend. Sharon stood just beyond the spotlight, her tears locked behind iron resolve. Every note, every light, was part of a farewell she had built from scraps of hope and oceans of grief. It didn't matter that his hands shook or that he needed help to stand. What mattered was that he rose, that he roared. And when the last chord vanished into a sky ablaze with fireworks, the world did not watch a goodbye. They witnessed liberation. This was not a concert. It was a confession. Resurrection. The Prince of Darkness did not fade into a sterile hospital room. He chose to vanish in fire and thunder, and Sharon, cloaked in shadow, knew she had done it. She had written his last chapter not in sorrow, but in flame. It was a night etched in eternity, woven from pain, crowned in sound. And in that sacred storm, she gave him the only farewell he would ever accept, the kind that left the world trembling. To truly grasp why that final performance meant everything, one must rewind, back to the beginning, to the ashes and agony from which Ozzy Osbourne rose. Because that last wish wasn't about applause or nostalgia. It was a man reclaiming his soul from the edge, rewriting his final verse not with regret, but with defiance. Born John Michael Osbourne on December 3, 1948, in Aston, Birmingham, he emerged from a backdrop of soot, poverty, and unrelenting hardship. Life dealt him cruelty early, no comforts, little warmth, and a constant thrum of factory clangor. At school, he was lost, battered by bullies and a hidden dyslexia that robbed him of confidence. By 17, he was imprisoned for burglary, sleeping on concrete, branded as hopeless. Yet amid despair, music became his salvation. Not a distraction, but breath, blood, lifeline. In 1968, alongside Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward, he birthed Black Sabbath. And when their 1970 debut album thundered into the world, critics scoffed, but the youth, aching and invisible, found truth. Ozzy's voice wasn't polished. It was pain, prophecy, rebellion. Sabbath gave metal its soul. Ozzy gave it a heartbeat. Songs like Paranoid, War Pigs, and Iron Man weren't tracks. They were lifelines for those drowning in silence. Yet his chaos wasn't only external. Addiction haunted him like a shadow. In 1979, he was ousted from the band he helped build. Many thought it was over. But Ozzy didn't collapse. He ignited. In 1980, with guitarist Randy Rhoads, he unveiled Blizzard of Oz, turning catastrophe into triumph. Crazy Train became a war cry, Mr. Crowley whispered gothic poetry, and Diary of a Madman proved he wasn't done. He was just beginning anew. His voice, that aching, electrified wail, carried both torment and transcendence. He fell. He rose, again and again. In 1991, No More Tears peeled back layers of sorrow. In 1992, Mama, I'm Coming Home wasn't just a song, it was a wound dressed in melody, a whispered apology to Sharon, and a hymn of redemption. Ozzy racked up Grammys, joined the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, and earned stars on Hollywood and Birmingham sidewalks. But it wasn't the awards that defined him. It was the mirror he held to broken souls. In 2002, MTV's The Osbournes unveiled a new Ozzy, fumbling, hilarious, deeply human. No longer just the Prince of Darkness, he became everyone's bewildered, endearing dad. Through tremors, surgeries, diagnoses, especially the cruel unveiling of Parkinson's in 2020, he never stopped. Even when pain screamed louder than amps, he recorded Patient Number 9 in 2022 Rising Again. Because Ozzy's legacy isn't vinyl, it's visceral. It's in every loner who heard themselves in his howl, in every outcast who found power in his defiance. His music didn't just fill arenas, it filled emptiness. That's why when he asked Sharon for one last stage, it wasn't performance. It was ritual. It wasn't nostalgia, it was closure. It was the roar of a soul refusing silence. And when Villa Park lit up and 40,000 hands reached skyward as Mama, I'm Coming Home echoed into the night, it wasn't an encore. It was immortality. A man who had clawed his way from prison cells to platinum records, who had turned trauma into thunder, was saying goodbye, on his terms, as only Ozzy could. As if the night itself remembered, the spotlight didn't shine on the stage. It turned back to where it all began. Because the fire in that final moment wasn't just in the music, it was in the memory. To understand it, we must go back, not to Hollywood or Manhattan, but to Birmingham, where a boy named John first learned to scream at the silence. This was more than Ozzy Osbourne's hometown. It was his crucible, the place that burned him, shaped him, and in the end, sanctified him. And in the summer of 2025, that city responded to his silent farewell with something holy, a love letter scrawled across bricks, bridges, and breath. They called it the Summer of Sabbath, but it was no mere tribute. It was a reckoning. From May to July, Birmingham wasn't just alive. It was burning with Ozzy. Murals of his youth towered over the same factories he once fled. Giant banners bearing his silhouette fluttered from street lamps like sacred cloth. Cafes played his anthems. School children studied his lyrics. Even the buses bore his name. But nothing compared to the renaming of one of the city's great bridges, now called the Osbourne Bridge. No longer just steel and stone, it became something mythic, a path from boyhood ashes to immortal flame. Beneath that sign, fans gathered in silence. Some prayed, some sang, some simply wept. Nearby, a bronze statue stood, with arms raised, mouth open, capturing forever the scream that had saved so many. It wasn't just a monument, it was a mirror for every misfit who ever found a home in his howl. Birmingham, once ashamed of him, now held him in awe. Pilgrims poured in, from London, Manchester, Tokyo, São Paulo. Some clutched old vinyls like relics. Others wore fresh tattoos wrapped in gauze. Families stood hand in hand, 3 generations in black shirts, bearing his name like a banner of blood. Elders hobbled toward Villa Park with oxygen tanks and tears. Teenagers danced in parking lots to the growl of war pigs. Strangers embraced without words, bound by one voice. But none of them knew the truth. Behind the noise of the Summer of Sabbath, a silence was creeping in. Sharon never said it. Ozzy never hinted. But those close to the fire felt it. His steps were slower. His gaze lingered longer. The jokes came softer, not roars, but echoes. Villa Park wasn't just a concert, it was an altar. And that night, it was never meant to celebrate. It was a requiem, a final defiant roar before surrendering to silence. But what a requiem it was. Children swayed to lyrics they couldn't yet understand. Old couples held each other close as Mama, I'm Coming Home floated out from pub windows. Taxi drivers told Ozzy tales like bedtime stories. It was a city intoxicated by memory, unaware that hope was already slipping through its hands. And just 17 days after that thunderous night, when amps had cooled and banners sagged in summer's stillness, Birmingham awoke. Not just to loss, but to duty. And it didn't mourn in whispers. It howled. Church bells rang not in grief, but like guitars. Local choirs sang Sabbath like sacred hymns. Candles lined the Osbourne Bridge. Shadows clung to the statue that now wept beside them. Because the final note hadn't faded, it had only begun to echo. And for all the stages Ozzy ever conquered, all the myths he carved into the face of rock, only Birmingham knew the boy beneath the crown. In its quiet streets, his echo, fierce, defiant, eternal, will never die. It was not a concert. It was a farewell ritual. On the night of July 5th, 2025, as darkness fell over Villa Park, 40,000 hearts stood still, not to hear a legend perform, but to witness final moment when history could still hold his voice. To them, Ozzy was never just a star. He was memory itself, memory that had carried them through heartbreaks, rebellions, resurrections. And that night, memory came back, not to be relived, but to say goodbye. No one but Sharon, the woman who had held his broken soul in her fragile but unyielding hands for decades, could have orchestrated the impossible. A return home, a back to the beginning carved out of love, forgiveness, and a silent vow that he would not leave this world alone. She brought back the brothers of his youth, Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, Bill Ward, not to reunite a band, but to stitch together the soul of a man so that he could pass whole. She summoned the giants of rock, Metallica, Guns N' Roses, Judas Priest, Anthrax, not to shake the stage, but to kneel in reverence before the one who built it. Fans came from every corner of the earth, clutching vinyls, tear-stained letters, and memories too sacred to speak aloud. They did not cry like an audience. They mourned like family watching their own blood fade from this life. And then he appeared. Ozzy Osbourne. He did not walk. He did not need to. They wheeled him out as if placing a blind king upon a throne forged in fire and agony. The crowd didn't roar. They wailed, as if witnessing the final breath of a myth they never believed could die. He sang, "Mama, I'm coming home." Not as a hit, but as the whisper of a wounded soul finally finding its way back to the light. His voice, frail as ash, still cut through the sky like a blade. Then came Crazy Train. No longer chaos, but a requiem. There were no speeches, no goodbyes, just a nod, a glance toward Sharon, the woman who had died in pieces so that he might live long enough to be mourned whole. The fireworks that followed weren't celebration. They were a funeral pyre painted in flame. That night was not an event. It was a sacred parting, a final covenant between a man and the world he once ruled with pain, with madness, with music, and with love. And when his eyes locked with hers, beneath the rain of fire, grief, and grace, the whole world understood. He was going home. And this time, he would not return. It felt brutally unfair that the world had to say goodbye to Ozzy Osbourne on July 22, 2025, just 17 days after he left an entire stadium breathless during Back to the Beginning, a tearful farewell that closed the book on half a century of screaming, burning, and living on stage. He passed in the arms of his family, but this was no peaceful ending. It was a silent war with death, fought in a stark white hospital room under the dry California sky. Sharon never let go of his hand, clutching every fading heartbeat as if love could somehow stop time. Their 3 children, Jack, Kelly, and Amy, stood still by the bedside, eyes glistening but holding back tears because they knew, if they cried, it would make his leaving real. Then Sharon whispered, "He looked at me as if he knew he couldn't stay. But he didn't want to go." Ozzy fought with all he had left, but fate, ever cruel, had already made its choice. The family was ready. The world wasn't. News of his death cut through the collective memory like a blade, an eruption of mourning that flooded social media, newspapers, radios, churches, pubs, and the very back streets, once electrified by his voice. The #, thank you. Ozzy trended across more than 60 countries overnight, a desperate grasp at memory, a refusal to let go. From New York to Tokyo, Manchester to Buenos Aires, people lit candles, gathered in silence, blasted his music into the night, as if trying to keep alive the last breath of a vanishing era. And then, the world understood. They hadn't just lost a rocker. They had lost the embodiment of reckless youth, of wild, beautiful chaos, of years when people dared to live, to err, to burn bright before surrendering to life's quiet routines. A generation suddenly felt itself grow old, as the heart that once thundered in the roar of amps fell quiet forever. And then, like a crack spreading across the soul of a generation, those who once stood beside Ozzy at the summit of music began to speak. Sir Elton John quietly shared a black and white photo from a backstage moment in the 80s, where he and Ozzy once laughed beneath dim lights. He was an untamable storm, a rebel poet with a tender heart. Today, the world feels colder. Rod Stewart offered only one aching line: "The loudest soul, with the gentlest heart I've ever known." Paul McCartney left a farewell that cut deep. "Legends don't die, they echo. Ozzy, your echo will never fade." But perhaps the most devastating tribute came from Tony Iommi, the brother in arms who had weathered every storm beside Ozzy. He posted a photo from their final rehearsal together and wrote, "I can't believe it. My friend, my brother Ozzy is gone. We shared a lifetime, laughter, madness, and music. There will never be another like him." The world didn't just grieve, it trembled. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame released a tribute film tracing Ozzy's journey from Birmingham's broken streets to global stardom. BBC aired a 10-hour special of his greatest hits, while ITV interrupted prime time with breaking news. The world mourns a legend. In London, his silhouette flickered in candlelight across Tower Bridge. In Birmingham, Symphony Hall glowed with his shadow. Times Square lit up with the words, "Thank you, Ozzy." From Tokyo to Sao Paulo, from Sunset Boulevard to war-torn corners of the world, fans gathered. 1,000 voices rose in Portuguese. Thousands held candles where he once roared. Even underground, in silence and rubble, his songs were sung. Because for the broken, the forgotten, and the rebellious, Ozzy Osbourne was more than music. He was salvation. And now, in one last global chorus, they all came back to say goodbye. Beneath the ashes of silence left after the final storm, the world held its breath, waiting for a voice. And it came. Not from a stage, not from a crowd, but from the deepest core of sorrow. Sharon. 3 days after Ozzy took his last breath, she appeared in a televised interview. No spotlight, just a soft lamp, a quiet chair, and on her hand, the wedding ring time had dulled. Every word she spoke cut deep. He didn't just want to live forever, he wanted to matter forever, and he did. Then, voice trembling but dry-eyed, she whispered, "He gave everything, even when there was nothing left to give." In that moment, the world no longer saw just a wife. They saw the final mirror reflecting Ozzy Osbourne's soul, torn, glorious, and immortal. The world bowed as one. No one said goodbye. They wailed, lit candles, and turned his music up loud, as if his guitar still pulsed through their veins. Memorials sprang up across the globe. Metallica renamed their tour the Crazy Train Legacy Tour. Bruce Dickinson assembled rock royalty for a tribute album. Even the Vatican spoke, for the first time. Though his path was thorned, his passion touched the soul of humanity. His funeral would remain private, but Sharon made one thing clear. Light a candle, play it loud. He would have wanted that, not silence. And when night fell, millions of flames flickered, each one a heartbeat stretched from Ozzy to every misfit he ever saved through sound, because he wasn't just a man who left this world, he was thunder. He was the final scream of a soul that never bowed. And now, as the last notes dissolve into the dark, one truth remains. He didn't leave in silence. He left in thunder. The concert at Villa Park was no longer just a charity show. It became the embodiment of Ozzy Osbourne's final, aching dream. And it was Sharon who made it real. In defiance of every obstacle, she orchestrated the impossible, reuniting his bandmates, summoning rock legends from across generations, and challenging the dire warnings of doctors, all to grant her husband the one thing he needed most, to be himself one last time. This wasn't about fundraising. It was about memory, about love, about giving a man who lived through madness and music a farewell on his own terms. Sharon, unyielding and quiet, refused to let the world remember Ozzy as a patient. She gave him back his identity. She protected his truth. And in doing so, she helped the man she loved face death, not with fear, but with fire. As the final lights dimmed, Ozzy did not fade. He ascended. His voice, now silenced by time, continues to thunder in the hearts of millions. His last breath was not a surrender. It was a song, a soul set free. His life had been a hurricane of fame and fury, but its ending was sacred, still, and filled with grace. The last bow of a legend who transformed darkness into defiance and pain into eternal sound. This story is more than music. It is about endurance, about burning passion that survives even as the body breaks. It is about love, raw, relentless, and transcendent. If you're still watching, perhaps you carry your own grief. Perhaps you've held a trembling hand in the silence of goodbye, or maybe you're clinging to your own final wish. To you, we offer this moment. Life can be cruel. It can tear and twist. But, in the end, love, real love, makes parting something holy. So let's whisper it one more time, from every corner of the world. Thank you, Ozzy. May the next life be gentler than this one. May your spirit scream even louder, and may your soul, finally unshackled, rest in power. Ozzy Osbourne, forever loved, forever immortal.